this is the story of Michelle O'Keefe, a young, aspiring actress whose tragic death would expose serious flaws in the justice system and leave a family struggling for answers for decades. Even in countries with well-established legal frameworks, justice is not always guaranteed. Innocent people can end up behind bars due to investigative errors, mishandled evidence, or critical oversights. In many cases, the truth only emerges years later when the real perpetrator is finally identified. But what happens when someone wrongfully convicted of murder is exonerated after spending more than a decade in prison, while the true killer remains free because crucial evidence was lost or overlooked? This is exactly what happened in the case of Michelle O'Keefe, an American student whose mysterious death in the early 2000s shocked the nation. The investigation initially focused on a single suspect who was convicted and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. For years, it seemed the case was closed. Then, after 11 long years, that conviction was overturned. The individual's innocence was finally proven, and new evidence emerged pointing toward another suspect believed by many to be the true killer. Now, more than 2 decades later, Michelle's parents remain deeply disillusioned with the justice system, struggling with the reality that the person responsible for taking their daughter's life may never face true accountability. To understand how this tragedy unfolded and why the investigation may have gone so wrong, we need to go back to the very beginning. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Your support helps keep these stories alive and ensures the victims are never forgotten. Now let's begin. Michelle Teresa O'Keefe was born on October 11, 1981, in the quiet town of Hanford, California. She was the oldest of 2 children, born to Patricia and Michael O'Keefe, and she grew up with her younger brother, Jason. The O'Keefes were a well-off family who owned a successful local business, and Michelle's parents were very dedicated to making sure their children received a good education and every chance to develop their skills and talents. Michelle was an exemplary student. She excelled academically, loved sports and ballroom dancing, and was widely known for her beauty, creativity, and artistic nature. From a young age, she dreamed of becoming a famous actress, appearing in films and making her mark in Hollywood. She had the ambition, confidence, and natural presence to pursue that dream. After graduating from high school with honors, Michelle was accepted into one of California's prestigious colleges. She continued dancing and enrolled in evening acting classes. She actively participated in auditions, appeared in commercials, and frequently worked as an extra in movies and music videos. On her 18th birthday, her proud parents gifted her a blue Ford Mustang featuring the new Edge design, a car Michelle had always dreamed of owning. Tragically, that eye-catching vehicle may have drawn the attention of her killer. On February 22, 2000, 18-year-old Michelle O'Keefe and her close friend Jennifer Peterson, also an aspiring actress, traveled to Palmdale in Los Angeles County for a video shoot. They were hired as extras for a music video by popular rock musician Robert James Ritchie, better known as Kid Rock. Both young women spent the day dancing in revealing outfits as part of the production. By the time the shoot ended and they returned to their cars at a nearby amusement park parking lot, it was already getting dark. Jennifer planned to head home, but Michelle still had acting classes scheduled for later that evening. The 2 friends chatted for a few minutes before parting ways. Jennifer walked toward her car, while Michelle stayed behind to change out of her video outfit. Feeling it would be inappropriate to attend her acting class in such provocative clothing, and with no private place nearby, Michelle decided to quickly change next to her car, believing she was alone. That decision would later be seen as a fatal mistake. Jennifer recalled lingering in the parking lot briefly while talking to her boyfriend on the phone. As she drove away, she noticed the headlights of Michelle's Mustang turn on. Assuming Michelle was about to follow her, Jennifer felt reassured. With music playing, the last thing she noticed before turning the corner was what appeared to be Michelle's car beginning to back out. That same evening, a 25-year-old security guard named Raymond Lee Jennings was on duty at the amusement park. At around 9 p.m., he heard sounds that resembled gunshots coming from the parking lot, followed by a car alarm. Unarmed and carrying only a taser, Jennings hesitated to approach alone. Knowing he would be defenseless against an armed attacker, he immediately contacted his supervisor, Iris Malone, and notified police. Malone arrived within minutes, and before law enforcement reached the scene, the two cautiously approached the parking lot. There, they saw a blue Ford Mustang stopped in the middle of the lane, headlights on and engine running. Inside the driver's seat sat Michelle O'Keefe, motionless. Upon closer inspection, Jennings and Malone saw blood inside the car and multiple gunshot wounds on Michelle's body. The driver's door was wide open, and the scene was horrifying. It appeared that Michelle had been chased, wounded in the parking lot, and had managed to get into her car and start it before the attacker caught up with her and fired several more shots, leaving her no chance to survive. Michelle was still wearing heavy makeup and had her hair styled for the video shoot. She had partially changed her clothes. She was wearing jeans and a shiny top, while a matching mini skirt and a t-shirt were found on the passenger seat. One shoe was still on her foot, while the other lay on the pavement, likely dropped as she ran for her life. The first law enforcement officer to arrive was a local sheriff's deputy. Although Michelle showed no signs of life, he immediately called emergency services and began documenting the scene. Statements were taken from Jennings and Malone, and arriving officers conducted a thorough search of the area. Several shell casings were found scattered across the parking lot, along with a bullet mark in the asphalt some distance from the car. Investigators concluded that the attacker likely fired an initial shot into the ground to intimidate Michelle before shooting at her directly. Bloodstains suggested she ran toward her car, but the assailant caught up to her and fired multiple additional shots. Michelle died almost instantly due to severe injuries and massive blood loss. In total, 5 shell casings were recovered. Although experts determined that all shots were fired from the same weapon, the bullets themselves differed significantly, raising troubling questions. An earring was also found at the scene, later identified by Jennifer as belonging to Michelle, further confirming the violent struggle that had taken place. However, the second earring was never found on or near the victim. At the time, this detail was considered insignificant and was largely overlooked. Much later, it would become clear that this was a crucial oversight. Investigators initially questioned Michelle's close relatives and friends. They all stated the same thing. Michelle had no known enemies. She was described as sociable, open, and exceptionally friendly. Everyone who knew her spoke warmly of her character. Because of this, a personal motive for the murder was almost immediately ruled out. The next theory explored was an attempted robbery or carjacking, possibly motivated by Michelle's new Ford Mustang. However, this explanation also seemed unlikely. The only item missing was her mobile phone, which she had used just minutes before the attack to tell her mother that filming had ended and she was on her way home. Michelle's purse, containing her wallet and several $100s in cash, was found at her feet in the passenger area. Police speculated that in the darkness and chaos, the assailant may not have noticed the purse, fearing that the gunshots had drawn attention from security, fled the scene without searching the vehicle. This could also explain why the carjacking attempt was aborted. Investigators believed the attacker may not have initially intended to shoot Michelle, but rather to threaten her with a weapon until something went wrong. Another theory suggested that Michelle may have been mistaken for a sex worker because of her appearance. She was dressed provocatively, wearing heavy makeup and high heels. It was possible the attacker noticed her in the parking lot, followed her, and approached her with intentions. When she firmly rejected him, he may have reacted with lethal violence. Supporting this theory was the fact that her top was partially pulled down, exposing her left breast, indicating the attacker was likely a man. However, it was also possible that her thin, strap-style clothing had simply slipped during the struggle, the chase, or as the frightened and wounded young woman attempted to get into her car. The The first person interrogated was Raymond, the security guard on duty at the parking lot, who was believed to be the only witness to the incident. He confirmed that he heard gunshots followed by a car alarm at around 9 p.m. and immediately reported what he heard to his supervisor before calling the police. Raymond stated that he did not see anyone in the parking lot either before or after the shots were fired. He also claimed that no one appeared to flee the scene in the minutes that followed. Given that it was still early in the evening and the area was usually busy, investigators found it plausible that someone else nearby might have seen or heard something. This prompted police to take a closer interest in Raymond himself. A background check revealed that despite his young age, he was the head of a large family and was raising 5 children. He had served in the California National Guard and aspired to become a law enforcement officer. At the time, he was working as a security guard while also studying at the police academy, gaining knowledge and skills relevant to criminal investigations. As the main witness to the murder, Raymond appeared eager to assist the investigation. He naively believed that his cooperation and experience would benefit him in his academy studies. When investigators asked him to provide a detailed account of how the crime might have unfolded, Raymond offered his own reconstruction of events. Being a diligent student, he carefully analyzed every detail, attempting to create a coherent narrative. He speculated about the possible positions of the attacker and the victim during the first gunshot and described how subsequent events may have occurred. His conclusions were based on the physical evidence, the location of shell casings, blood droplets, the victim's belongings, and the position of the car. He even estimated shooting distances. At the time, Raymond did not realize that by doing so, he was unwittingly placing himself under suspicion. He believed he was simply helping the investigation and trying to be useful. However, the detectives investigating the case drew their own conclusions. They believed that such detailed knowledge of the crime scene and the sequence of events could only be possessed by the murderer himself. Since there were no other viable suspects, the security guard was charged with the girl's murder. A few weeks after Michelle's murder, a 17-year-old African-American girl named Victoria Richardson came to the notice of the police. On the night of the tragedy, she was in the parking lot along with her 18-year-old boyfriend and a couple of friends. Earlier that evening, the group had spent time horseback riding in the park and returned to the parking lot after it had gotten dark on February 22nd. According to Victoria, they were sitting in their car with loud music playing, preparing to leave when they heard unusual sounds. At first, they assumed the noises were firecrackers or fireworks and did not pay much attention. Moments later, they realized the sounds were gunshots. Victoria recalled that about a minute and a half earlier, she had seen a man wearing a security guard's uniform walking toward a parked blue Ford Mustang nearby. After the strange sounds and the activation of a car alarm, the group got out of their car and noticed the Mustang had rolled backward and stopped, no longer moving. They then reportedly saw the security guard again, who warned them that there was an armed person in the parking lot and advised them to be cautious. Alarmed, the group quickly returned to their car and carefully left the area, trying not to attract attention. When asked to describe the guard they had seen, Victoria said he was a middle-aged, heavy-set African-American man. This description matched another security employee who had worked in the parking lot the day before Raymond's shift. That guard was quickly detained and questioned, but he had a solid alibi. At the time of the murder, he had been attending a family gathering, and about 20 people confirmed his presence there. Despite the inconsistencies in witness statements, Raymond Jennings remained the sole suspect. After 5 years of investigation, authorities continued to insist that Raymond was the killer. This belief was based largely on his knowledge and skills in forensics, which investigators argued could have allowed him to convincingly deflect suspicion away from himself. However, the evidence and witness testimonies did not align coherently. The crime itself appeared irrational and strange, with no clear motive attributed to Raymond. He legally owned a pistol, but it was not with him on the night of the murder. Raymond voluntarily presented the weapon to the police, and forensic testing confirmed that the bullets recovered from the scene were not fired from his gun. Investigators speculated that he might have possessed and concealed an unregistered firearm, but this theory was never substantiated. At the same time, Michelle's parents began conducting their own investigation, hiring private detectives. Patricia and Michael O'Keefe believed law enforcement was mishandling the case or showing a lack of urgency. They actively participated in interviews and television appearances, sharing their story to apply public pressure. They were convinced that Raymond was responsible for Michelle's death and believed he should be held accountable. Although there were initially no strong grounds to detain him, Raymond later went to Iraq for military service, where he remained for nearly 5 years. Upon his return to the United States, he was immediately arrested and jailed. Raymond agreed to undergo a polygraph test, which he failed, further damaging his position. Unable to post the $1 million bail that was set, he remained in custody for about a year while investigators and his defense team prepared for trial. According to the prosecution, Raymond, while on duty as a security guard, mistook Michelle, who was wearing a revealing outfit, for a sex worker and followed her to her car. They alleged that after she rejected his advances, he opened fire and then radioed his supervisor about the incident, stating that he would not approach the crime scene. The defense emphasized that the murder weapon was never found, either on the night of the crime or afterward. There were no fingerprints, DNA traces, or any physical evidence placing Raymond at the scene. Notably, epithelial cells found under Michelle's fingernails did not match Raymond's DNA, rather than identifying whose DNA it was. Investigators argued that it was incidental contamination unrelated to the case. Raymond's personal belongings, vehicle, locker, and home were thoroughly searched for the murder weapon, but a gunshot residue test on his clothing was never conducted at the time. Additionally, Raymond resigned from his job a few days after the incident due to threats from unknown individuals and returned his work uniform, which police did not receive until a week later. Investigators claimed the uniform had been thoroughly washed, potentially eliminating any gunpowder residue. However, traces of sweat and dust found on the uniform suggested that it had not been washed, contradicting earlier claims. During the trial, Victoria Richardson, the previously mentioned witness, testified that she had seen a security guard in the parking lot around the time of the shooting. However, she could not clearly identify who she saw, explaining that the darkness and confusion made it impossible to be certain. Despite this uncertainty, the prosecution relied heavily on her testimony to support their case against Raymond. The jury deliberated for an entire week, but was unable to reach a unanimous verdict. As a result, a retrial was scheduled, allowing both sides additional time to prepare. In February 2009, during the second trial, 11 out of 12 jurors voted to convict Raymond of murder. In December 2009, the Supreme Court formally found Raymond Jennings guilty of murder under aggravating circumstances and sentenced him to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole after 40 years. Raymond continued to maintain his innocence. In his final statement to the court, he insisted that he felt no remorse because he had not committed the crime. Despite his claims, Michelle's parents and her brother were convinced of his guilt and felt satisfied that justice had been served. Raymond Jennings went on to spend nearly 11 years behind bars. Over time, hope began to fade as his repeated appeals were denied, leaving him trapped in a prolonged legal battle and a justice system that appeared unwilling to reconsider his case. However, in late 2015, renowned attorney Jeffrey Eric and his son Clinton, a law student at the time, took an interest in Raymond Jennings's case. They meticulously revisited the case files and uncovered numerous errors, inconsistencies, and blatant violations in the evidence and trial proceedings. Convinced that Raymond had been wrongfully convicted, they set out to prove his innocence. The Erics compiled all available evidence and appealed to the department responsible for reviewing convictions. They highlighted that Raymond's uniform showed no gunpowder residue or blood spatter, only sweat and dust, indicating it had not been involved in the shooting. They also noted that Raymond had been unarmed that evening, and that investigators had failed to consider other individuals present at the park. New reports suggested that Michelle's murder was a spontaneous act, likely a botched robbery attempt. Moreover, Victoria Richardson, the main witness, and her boyfriend, both with prior criminal records and serving time for armed robbery at the time of Raymond's trial, were never investigated as suspects. The fact that different cartridges were fired from the same gun, unusual for someone with military training, suggested a street gang-style attack. Richardson and her boyfriend were affiliated with such a gang, but because they were overlooked during the investigation, many leads were irretrievably lost. Notably, the boyfriend wore an earring resembling the one found at the crime scene the night of the murder. While their investigation did not definitively prove the involvement of Richardson and her boyfriend, the Erics successfully demonstrated Raymond's innocence. As a result, the former security guard was factually acquitted, a significant distinction from legal or presumptive innocence. After nearly 11 years wrongfully imprisoned, Raymond Jennings was released. The judge noted that jurors had not been informed about the presence of gang members at the crime scene. In March 2017, Raymond received $500,000 in compensation for his wrongful conviction. A devout man, he later stated that God had heard his prayers and that justice had finally prevailed. Despite Raymond's exoneration, Michelle O'Keefe's parents remained deeply upset, believing that the person they thought killed their daughter had been freed. Already grieving the loss of their son in a car accident, they clung to the belief that justice had not been fully served. With the case still unsolved, the likelihood of anyone being held accountable for Michelle's murder is now extremely low. Thanks for watching, guys. Please subscribe to the channel and don't forget to click the bell icon on all. There are many more shocking stories ahead.